All right, so I've been coming down to the occupation for probably the same kind of reasons that you guys have as well. So we've seen the largest financial crisis of a generation. We're paying to clear up that mess with the loss of jobs. We're paying for it with the rise in taxes, and we're paying for it with the cut in services. And meanwhile, the people who caused that mess, the banks, are sustaining their pay and bonuses, and they're getting back to the same profit levels as before. So it's business as usual for the very people who got us into this mess. So the Robin Hood tax is one idea for trying to redress that balance. And it basically boils down to a 0.05% tax on banks' financial transactions. So it's not 20%, it's not 5%, it's not 1%, it's 0.05%. It's tiny. And it's on things like bonds, shares, currency and derivatives. Although it's tiny, it's capable of raising billions of pounds a year, which we can put to good causes in the UK. So helping to avoid the worst of the cuts, and we can use it internationally as well for the people who've lost out as a result of the financial crisis they've done nothing to cause. And I'm sure Stephen will go over some of the arguments that, the reasons why it won't work. But just to head some of those off, I should say they already exist in the world. It's not a pipe dream. We can look around to 40 examples that have happened in different countries around the world. In fact, the best example is right here in the City of London. It's a small 0.5% in this case, tax on shares. It raises 4 billion quid for the government, and it didn't cause a loss of business. So in other words, this thing works. Why are we campaigning for this above other ideas? Basically because it stands a chance of happening. I've been working on this thing for years, and it was an idea on the periphery of the mainstream. Now we're smack bang in the middle of the mainstream. It's not just us who are calling for it. Germany and France are calling for it. The European Parliament's calling for it. The European Commission's calling for it. We have 1,000 economists, including Nobel laureates, in support. We have 250,000 people part of our campaign, millions all over the world. And the important date for us is the G20, which is coming up in just over a week. We know it's on the agenda. Bill Gates is going to be there speaking about it. So what we're hoping will happen is that the Occupy movement around the world are going to support this. And we know there's already been some support in Australia, there's been some support in the US. So I'm just going to end with two statistics. One is that on the stock exchanges, it used to be that people would go onto the floor and they would buy and sell shares. Now, 72% on the New York Stock Exchange is done by computers. Nobody involved, computers sitting in banks' offices, churning thousands of trades a second, making them billions, and it jeopardizes the rest of the economy and puts it at risk. So it's grown into this huge thing. And to back that up, at the beginning of the 1900s, the 3 UK banks were 7% of our GDP. At the end of the 1900s, they were 75%. Last year, HSBC alone, that's one bank, is 200 times the size of our GDP, is 200% the size of our GDP, so it's twice the size. Banks have grown out of control. There's nothing natural about it. They've been fueled with the equivalent of steroids by the state, and the Robin Hood tax is one idea to bring them back under control.
That's a good point, Simon. Thank you very much. Right, thank you. Well, I actually agree with some of what Simon's just said. I'm certainly not in favour of bailing out banks. I think that taxing ordinary low-income taxpayers to save rich people from the consequences of bad investment decisions is outrageous, quite frankly. And I think there's also a case that financial institutions have become significantly too large, particularly if they're based in a medium-sized economy like the UK. We'll come to that in a moment. What I'd like to argue is that what Simon's proposing is actually, from your point of view, I take it most of you are on the same sort of side as him, and indeed myself on some of these issues, it's not the right way of going about it. Essentially, and I think you've got this even from his own talk, there's two contradictory kind of ideas about what this kind of tax will achieve. The first is that it will actually slow down the rate of financial transactions. It will reduce the amount of volatility in the market. So you'll have simply fewer transactions going on, less churn as they call it. But it's also supposed to raise large amounts of revenue. Now, the thing is, those two things are in contention with each other. It's like taxes on tobacco. They're supposed to stop people smoking, but to the extent that they stop people smoking, they don't raise revenue. So if your main goal of having a tax on something like tobacco is to raise revenue, you basically desperately want people to stop smoking. And it's the same is true in this. In order to raise the really large amounts of revenue that are being quoted, you'd have to have not that much of a reduction in the number of transactions. If you do want to reduce the transactions, then you shouldn't expect that this is a way of raising revenue. You should support it for quite different reasons. The other thing is, and this is related to this, that there's the argument that it's like a teeny-weeny tax that no one will notice, but it's also a tax that will then raise a humongous amount of money from the financial services sector. And again, I say you can't have it both ways. If people are paying large amounts of money, they're certainly going to notice it. And as a result, they might change their behaviour. Now, what are the risks? Now, I will say that the kind of risks I'm going to quickly run through would not apply if the kind of tax we're talking about was done on a global basis. The thing is that is simply not going to happen because there are too many powerful players who aren't going to agree to it. I don't see any prospect of such a ban getting through the American political system, and the Chinese government has made it very clear they're not in favour of it. What is likely to happen on the evidence is that if you tax all financial transactions, as opposed to certain categories of them, the examples Simon gives basically refer to share transfers, if you tax all of those things, then the business will simply migrate. Sweden tried having a financial transactions tax, which is what we're talking about, in the 1980s, and 85% of their business in that area migrated. Well, we think it migrated, it just disappeared. We just presume it went elsewhere. Now, why is this? Why is it that such a small, tiny little level of tax, I mean, it's less than a fraction of 1%, can have such a big effect? The reason is that a lot of financial transactions individually are actually very, very narrow profit margins. The reason why the banks make so much money out of them is because they do an awful lot of them. And so that's why the effect can actually be apparently quite dramatic. What I'd finally conclude by saying is that if you want to do things about this, there are other things you can do which I think would be more effective. Now, I might not agree with all these myself, but I think they're less harmful than what Simon's advocating. For example, you could support the financial activity tax, with the wonderful acronym of FAT, of course, which the EU has also been looking at, which is essentially a special extra corporation and income tax on the financial services sector alone. That's much more transparent and it shouldn't have the same kind of dramatic effects upon market transactions at levels. If you want to reduce volatility and risk-taking, you could do things like, for example, not allowing people to take out credit default swaps unless they have an underlying insurable interest in the asset that the CDS is attached to. There are a whole range of other things you could do of that sort. Some I would agree with, some I wouldn't. But I think that all of these are more likely to actually achieve your ends than the kind of tax that you're having proposed here.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, just from what you said, I've got a question for each of you, and if you want to use that as an opportunity to respond as well. So Simon, what's the ambition from your perspective? Is this something to quell speculative markets, or is this something that is all about raising revenue?
Primarily, we think there's a responsibility for the financial sector to pay their fair share for all the mess they've caused, so the money can go home and abroad. The beauty of this tax is that it particularly targets an area of the market that's got nothing to do with us, nothing to do with retail banking, nothing to do with going and putting your credit card in the machine and taking some money out. It hits the casino type operations where they do massive amounts of churning type trades. So it's very targeted at that, and that's where we get to the tiny tax, but it raises a lot of money. It's 0.05%. So if you put your money in a pension, it's not going to affect it. However, if you're sitting in front of an algorithmic computer making these trades happen, it is going to hit you, and it will have an effect. But we need to get it straight. It's a completely separate area of the banking system, and it's the very area that got us into trouble in the first place.
Okay, so you said that unless this is applied globally, multilaterally, it's not going to work. If that's the case, why are the French and the Germans, who I believe are advocating for it, why are they so keen?
I think for two reasons. One is that they are quite desperate to raise money at the moment because of the financial problems the Eurozone is having. I think the other reason is because they would hit the City of London most severely. I think the straightforward internal European political machinations in hand here.
Sorry, let me understand. So if the European Union adopted it, it would affect Britain whether we like it or not?
Yes, effectively it would mean that the funds that would be generated by this would come disproportionately from the UK. So that's that's why they're quite keen on it.
So how does a migration away from that
market
work?
That would actually be migration out of the EU. So in fact, to the extent that happened, they would actually be disappointed in their revenue raising expectations, I would say, because the migration, a lot of the trade would then just go to Singapore or Hong Kong. Now, there's a separate argument about whether or not you do need a lot of the trade that's going on, and whether a lot of these derivative trades are in fact things that you should allow to happen. But the issue for that is more, I'd say it's more to do with banking regulation.
But my question was, if in reality the argument is that the trades will move away, why would the French and the Germans be keen to do that? They don't believe that.
They don't believe that.
Right,
will happen,
so that's an argument.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if there are any questions, anyone would like to ask a question, maybe something that's unclear?
Simon said it wouldn't affect you if you're buying a pension. Well, not so, because this tax, if I was for example, buying shares to put into some kind of pension fund, that would attract the tax. And so to the extent that the tax actually affects the cost of that transaction, it would ultimately be borne by the person drawing the pension. But in fact, one of the things is that it's very hard to work out who would actually bear the burden of this tax. And that's really a really bad basis on which to fund your tax policy. Taxes should always be transparent wherever possible.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we're talking about the casino banking here and not retail banking. So you're right, it will fall to the customers as well. Who are the customers of the casino banking? Well, it's mostly other banks, and if it's not other banks, it's the hedge funds. Who are the people putting money into that? It's the high net worth individuals, which has led the IMF, of all people, which is not exactly a liberal institution on these matters, to say it would be highly progressive and it's most likely to fall on the rich people. Governments are desperate to raise more money. They've got to do something. So you can't compare it to nothing, you must compare it to doing something else. The alternative that the UK government has chosen is implementing VAT, which we've all felt, and it's been shown to hit the poorest twice as hard as the richest. So with this tax, yes, who would pay it would be spread, but it would be spread between the richest sectors of society.
That's a very good question. There's been argument about that going on precisely at the moment, about whether it comes under qualified majority voting or not. So,
yeah, I mean, our battle at the moment is to get the UK not to block it. A couple of years ago they were supportive, now they're very much against. We need to get them to a position where they're not blocking this thing.
Can you put that into context?
It is majority voting then?
It depends. So ideally we'd like to see this at a global level. If that doesn't work, we want to see it at a European level, which includes the UK as well. If that doesn't work, then France and Germany have indicated they're happy to go at a Eurozone level. So in other words, just the Euro, which would leave the UK outside. Now there is stories in the press that the UK could be made to do it anyway. We don't know if those are true yet.
We don't know yet. This is all up in the air, isn't it? Yes.
Right. The other thing to put in context is it's not just happening at the European level, but the G20 level. So we have the G20 meeting in a week's time, and there Bill Gates is reporting to the G20, and critically on this point, how the money can be used for development and climate change. So i.e. the people who've lost out and the causes that have lost out as a result of the financial crisis. And at that level, again, the UK are blocking, so that's our battle there. But we have a decent coalition of the willing, which includes Germany, which has a massive financial sector, so it's very significant, and it includes France, and it includes a number of others as well.
Why have we had a big crisis in the last few years? Well, I think in some ways Simon's right. It's because the banks have been fed on steroids by the central banks, and we've had an enormous credit-fueled boom over the last 10 years. So I think that this is the wrong solution to that problem. There are other things we could do. I'm certainly in favour of, I'm not in favour of people, like I say, rich people who've made cockeyed investment decisions being bailed out by the rest of us. As I said, I think that's completely outrageous, actually. And what we desperately need to do is to work out an institution for the orderly winding up of bankrupt financial institutions. You can't have a system where banks are different from any other kind of business. The whole principle of capitalism is that if a business can't make a profit, it gets wound up. But banks at the moment are a business where profits are private and losses are dumped on the public, and that's, you can't go on in that way.
Okay, right. Liquidity. It's good to have a liquid market because then the prices that things are meant to be priced at get there quicker.
Yeah.
The problem is that there's good liquidity and there's bad liquidity. The kind of churning that I've been talking about that's carried out by the computers is bad liquidity, because at the moment there's a problem, they disappear out of there, so you lose your liquidity anyway.
I don't disagree with that, actually. I mean, I just think this isn't the way to do it. I think what we should do is actually outlaw quite a range of financial instruments that are around at the moment. I think that, for example, with credit default swaps, my personal view is that you shouldn't be allowed to hold a credit default swap unless you have an insurable interest in the underlying asset, because in the same way that I'm not allowed to take out a life insurance policy on any one of you guys, because that would give me rather bad incentives, to put it mildly, if I was to benefit from your something dropping dead. So I don't see why you should be allowed to hold a credit default swap in completely different things.
There is a lot of good ideas that would sort out the financial sector, because it's extremely screwed up.
Get rid of it.
The thing about, for instance, but the thing about the Robin Hood tax or the financial transaction tax is that we have a chance of making this thing happen. It's gone from the peripheral into the mainstream. It's not just campaigning organisations like ourselves that are calling for it, but governments, and even at the European level. So that's why we're focusing all of our attention on it, particularly in the next week or two up to the G20. Yeah.
There is a sense of starting a roller effect where if the European Union goes in, others might follow?
Yeah, so global level, brilliant, just like everybody wants world peace, brilliant, but you can't wait for that to happen because you'll just be waiting around for the rest of your lives. You need to start it somewhere. It's already started in the UK of all places, in fact, because they've got this tiny financial transaction tax on shares, raises 4 billion quid. So we're talking about, yes, a coalition of the willing, taking it forward as a first step towards global agreement. That's what France has signed up for, that's what Germany signed up for, that's what the UK government's blocking at the moment. The Swedish example is often trotted out for people who critique the financial transaction tax, but it's a bit like me bringing a picture of a bike here with square wheels and saying, look, the idea of bikes is a crap idea, it will never do anything, because they designed it badly, they implemented it, and they lost a load of business. That's not what happened in the UK. We designed it well, we didn't lose our business, and we're raising 4 billion quid a year.
Essentially is that if you don't bail out distressed financial institutions, you will have knock-on effects for the entire financial system, and you'll end up with not being able to get cash out of the ATM. I actually don't believe that that is the case. It seems to me that banks, rather than governments bailing out distressed banks, they could have simply ensured that there was what you might call the infrastructure aspect of banking could have been kept going. The problem was that they didn't have a system in place to wind up banks. Now, maybe that was, therefore, they weren't left with much choice, but it's absolutely outrageous that it's, 3 years now since Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we still don't have a legal mechanism for winding up a bankrupt bank.
I completely agree with that. It's not really the Robin Hood tax campaign stuff, but we use 1.2 trillion of public money in the UK alone to bail out the banks. If you've got that kind of pot of money, imagine what else you could do with it if you pumped it directly into the normal economy, the real economy, where people have jobs and businesses.
Isn't a tax on trading going to be easier to police in terms of making sure that people don't exploit tax avoidance techniques to actually stop paying taxes institutions?
So the brilliant thing about the financial transaction tax is if I'd been standing here 20 years ago trying to make the case for it, it would be a difficult thing to implement because a lot of stuff was passed around on paper. However, the market's electronic now, so it literally is as simple as every time a transaction happens in a share or in a derivative, 0.05% or whatever the rate gets taken off and it gets sent to the relevant central bank. It's the way it works in the UK with the stamp duty. It's the way it could work globally with all these different types of transactions, be it currency derivatives, bonds or shares.
Yeah, that is true. Yes, it's easier to police than an income tax.
And as the IMF have pointed out, one of the great advantages of it is it's super cheap to do because you don't have to police it like you do income tax and the rest of it.
The problem is essentially that it's 100% certainty you can pay the tax if it's done electronically, as Simon says. The thing is, the profit margins on a lot of these trades are actually really, really low, so they wouldn't take place if the tax was being levied. Now, you may say then, well, why make them anyway? But that's a different argument. And that means, therefore, there probably will be a sharp decline in the volume of transactions. Now, that's what you want. Well, fine, but it isn't going to raise you money. That's my point. You can calculate how many fewer transactions there would be, and on that you can make assumptions about what the revenue flow would be. But the honest answer is we don't know, but there are very strong grounds, I think, for thinking there would be a very big drop. So,
can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, those figures are dubious, as the European Commission says itself. It's probably a lot lower than that. And the fact is, you've got to ask what sort of GDP, what sort of economy do we want, I mean, we're talking about churning of high-frequency trades. That they may put up numbers on the GDP, but they've got absolutely zero social value. They have absolutely zero positive benefit to our normal economy. So it would be about reducing that end of the trade. Also, we're only talking about the negative. The European Commission said absolutely nothing about the positive, which is that you rebalance the economy away from the casino-type risky gambling that got us into trouble. So all these supposedly highly intelligent people, maybe they would have, a bit more impetus to go and get a job in the real economy and do something with a bit more value to the rest of us.
It's the highly technical ones that have been invented in the last 10 years that are problematic. Some of them I would simply outlaw. I mean, I think there's probably a case for saying that. You should simply not allow some of these derivatives to be traded.
In practical terms, Stephen, this is what's on offer. I mean, it may not be ideal, but this is what's on offer. And is it better to at least get behind this and then see how it can be tweaked to address the revenue issues, which is what effectively happens with all taxes. You go in, you take a punt, and then you adjust it so that it does what you want it to do, rather than not support this?
Well, I actually suspect that if you're not careful, I mean, Simon says at the moment there is a kind of big political impetus behind this, and that's certainly true. What I would fear is, in fact, that if something like this is done and then it turns out not to work, that all that capital, if you will have been spent. I would think it makes more sense to think of some other kind of concrete things you could do, many of which could be done quite smallly and would be much more easily done at a national level, I think.
You know, this is not some idea that somebody dreamt up. You know, it's being done in the real world. All we want to see is it rolled out so the financial sector is actually paying a decent amount of money back on a regular basis.
Even if this tax goes ahead through the EU and if Britain were to be part of it, what's the worst case scenario that would lead to? And just before you answer, I'm going to ask the same question to you. If we're not involved and it goes through, what's the worst case scenario that that's going to lead to?
Okay, well, I mean, the worst case scenario would be that this would lead to a major loss of liquidity in the markets and a significant flight of business to the Far East, essentially, which would have a big knock-on effect on the British economy and would leave us with not much extra revenue, maybe less revenue than the economy effect. So that's the worst case scenario, essentially.
The worst case if it doesn't go through?
If it doesn't, well, if it goes to the European level and the UK doesn't support it, then it will show the government is unable to bring the financial sector under control. It also means that the revenue that Europe's getting from its financial sector, we won't be getting, which would be shocking when they're saving all the money by cutting services. So, that is for us exactly the worst case scenario, and that's exactly why we need to pile the pressure on the UK government at this point to be backing it.
Okay, and I'll just say that.